Okay, hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1. And there's a lot of interest in Marx recently, of course, because especially after the 2008 financial crisis, but also because of a host of other imminent catastrophes such as climate change and the ongoing COVID crisis, skyrocketing global inequality, and so on and so forth. And people are turning again to Marx's ideas to try to explain why all these things are happening, why everything feels like it's going wrong. For many people, it never has been going right from the beginning anyway, and trying to understand the system, the global economic system that we live in today, which is capitalism. And why are people turning to Marx? Because, put simply, he offered the most insightful and in-depth investigation and critique of capitalism and of classical political economy that has yet existed. So I'm going to go into Capital Volume 1 today and try to explain very simply some of his key ideas. And I want to state from the beginning that I'm drawing from an abridged version of Karl Marx. It contains of Marx's all of his 3 volumes of Capital. Contains most of the key information, but now I realize some people might say, "Well, Justin, why are you drawing from an abridged version?" Well, the answer is quite simple, because my field of study is modern Japanese history, not Karl Marx, and not everyone has time to read 6,000 pages or whatever of all 3 of the volumes of Capital. So I turned instead to this abridged version because I think it's more accessible for some people, again, who want to engage with Marx's ideas, but might feel jumping right into the 3 original volumes, or all of them in their entirety, is a bit daunting. Okay, so here we go. Okay, Karl Marx, Capital, Volumes 1 and 3, abridged, summary and analysis. The edition is a new abridgment put out by Oxford University Press in 1995. And today, in this first talk, I'll just look at the Volume 1 section of this. Okay, so Marx starts out in Chapter 1 looking at commodities. And basically, his key point is that he's going to argue against a couple of different schools of economic thought that had been prevalent up until that time, such as the mercantilist school, for instance, and others who thought that value came from circulation, simply from buying low and selling high. But Marx first argues against this. He says in these first chapters that no, value does not come from circulation, but rather from human labor, labor power, which I will abbreviate throughout this talk as either LP or L variously. And this aligns actually with other thinkers such as Ricardo and Adam Smith, and kind of the founding people in classical political economy who first put forth the labor theory of value. Now, some people think that Marx just invented the labor theory of value. He did not. This already existed before him, and it was really invented by people and popularized by people such as Adam Smith. But Marx also takes it a step further than those other thinkers, and he critiques political economy. And one of the reasons for that is because whereas classical political economists recognize that value came from human labor power, Marx showed how this is in fact, based on extreme levels of the exploitation of and the robbing of human labor power. And why does he start with the commodity? Well, he starts with the commodity because basically value's origin is hidden behind various forms under capitalism. We don't actually see where the value comes from. We don't see that labor power. All we see is its forms. And the main form is the commodity. And that's why Marx starts looking at this. So he says that commodities mask these unequal social relations and conditions that give rise to them. They appear as naturally existing objects when in fact they are social representations of value. Okay, and then he goes further. He looks into this different kinds of value. Okay, so commodities have use values, or they are use values. They serve particular functions for people, but they're also exchange values under capitalism, meaning that they're placed in an equivalent relationship or that they're exchangeable with all other commodities. And this is important because this equivalency relationship means that the labor included in each individual commodity becomes abstracted so that it forms a, quote, congelation of homogeneous human labor, of labor power expended without regard to the mode of its expenditure, i.e. abstract labor. Okay, so we don't see just the labor of the one farmer who raised the group of tomatoes or whatever. All of this is hidden behind the commodities, right? And then all of that, because that bundle of tomatoes or whatever, the bushel of tomatoes, a bunch of coats, computers, phones, all these things, because they're all placed in an equivalency relationship with each other, they're all buyable and sellable and tradable. All of that labor power then becomes congealed into something that is also comparable and equivalent. And this is what Marx refers to as abstract labor, okay? So the social value of a commodity is measured by the amount of time necessary to produce it. This is called socially necessary labor time. Why is this important? Well, because it's fundamentally important for what we just talked about, for abstract labor, and because all of these commodities are in an equivalency relationship with each other. So think about this. Once upon a time, commodity A used to be made by hand, and it took a long time. But then a new invention or a machine came out that allowed that commodity to be made in half the time. Or, put differently, the same amount of time produces 2 times the amount of commodities that can be produced. Now, the total value of that commodity becomes spread out over a larger amount, over a larger quantity of commodities, meaning that for each individual commodity, the value falls. But what if producer X still makes commodity A by hand using the old method? Well, it doesn't matter because all labor is abstract in this sense. The value of commodity A still falls across the board. And this is why abstract labor, and this is why it is abstract labor, and why Marx calls it socially necessary labor time, because it's determined by the shortest amount of time it takes to make a given commodity in society. And even if a producer can't produce it in that amount of time, it doesn't matter, because it still affects the total value of that labor. So the value of commodities becomes abstracted through this social equivalency relationship. But hey, aren't some commodities harder to make than others? Yes, but it doesn't matter. They're still in an equivalency relationship, and it's simply the quantity that matters for exchange value. All commodities are equal, just in different proportions. So if new technology comes out that allows someone to produce more faster, this does yield more wealth for that individual capitalist, but lower value per commodity being produced, and thus there's a decrease in the total value of all circulating commodities, and importantly, as Marx talks about much later, eventually in the total amount of capital being circulated as well. So through this equivalency relationship, then, commodities take on a value form, which is a purely social reality, says Marx. The simplest value relation is to compare 2 commodities, for example, X commodity A and Y commodity B. Could be Marx's favorite example, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. Why? Because it takes 20 yards of linen to make 1 coat or something like that, right? The value of linen thus is expressed as a quantity of coats, i.e. as a relative value, whereas the coat is an equivalent value. Its value is equivalent to 20 yards of linen. The value of a commodity can't be expressed non-relatively. For example, 20 yards of linen can't equal 20 yards of linen. That doesn't make any sense. And the same commodity can't be both relative and equivalent, meaning that you can't trade back a coat for the linen, right? So the coat embodies both use value as a coat, right? We can wear a coat. It's very convenient. It helps us stay warm. But it also embodies the value of the linen now too, which has become a part of that coat. So it is the value form of the linen. The coat is the value form of linen. The coat thus consists of abstract labor, the weaving that made the linen, and all labor thus becomes abstract labor, and all equal in commodities. Okay? So it's too complex to think about how all commodities express their value relatively to each other. So we do this instead with money. Okay? We can't think about the entire web of commodities and how many bushels of apples equal how many bundles of bananas. We can't do that, right? It's too complicated. So we need some kind of equivalent, and we need an easy way to express this, and that's done with money. So the simple way to think of the value form is simply to think of it as money. Although, of course, it's much more than this too, as will be touched on later. Concrete labor is thus labor expended to produce an individual commodity, while abstract labor is labor considered as a whole between all commodities in an equivalency relationship. And these are often confused, and people say, what is abstract labor? Oh, it's this, oh, it's that, oh, it's a certain measure of time. No, it's just what I said, right? It's labor considered as a whole between all commodities in an equivalency relationship. Meaning that the labor embodied in the coat by tailoring is equivalent to the labor embodied in the linen through weaving. And all of these get abstracted into the value form of the coat. And labor of the individual acquires a purely social form by being equivalent to other forms of labor. Okay? We're still on commodities though. So Marx really, brings it out in full force right from the beginning, right? Capital is not an easy book per se, and some of the beginning chapters are especially hard for people to get through. But they're very important because they set the stage for all of Marx's later argument, okay? And Marx says, every product of labor is, in all states of society, a use value. But it is only at a definite historical epoch in a society's development that such a product becomes a commodity, namely, at the epoch when the labor spent on the production of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of that article, i.e., its value. So all commodities are thus linked through the equivalency relationship in abstract labor. Each new commodity is a new expression of value, but the link chain of commodities is infinite. It is impossible to grasp in its totality. So we need something to function as a universal equivalent that is easily recognizable to express any commodity's value quickly, by which all other commodities can relate their value. And this role is played by money, which was expressed in gold in Marx's time. Okay, so now we have forms of value. We have A, the relative form, B, the equivalent form, C, the universal equivalent, and D, the money form. The universal equivalent being gold, and then money form, okay? When D, the money form, becomes the money commodity, then the general form of value is changed into the money form, i.e. all value becomes expressed in money. You can't express some things in linen anymore once you shift to a money economy. More, the relative form of any commodity when expressed in money equals the price form. Okay, so even easier way to express this. We have the price form now, right? But you can see how all of these different forms slowly lead us farther and farther away from where value actually comes from, which is human labor, okay? And incidentally, then Marx also talks about fetishism, is when social relations between men appear simply as relations between things or objects, and objects appear to have their own existence, when in fact they are created by man's own labor. Individual labor only appears through exchange, and social relations are mediated through exchange. So when we only see these forms, when we say, ooh, money, yeah, that's value, that's wealth, right? But we don't see the other things, the labor behind those products and the conditions, social conditions under which they were produced, then we are engaging in fetishism. All right, and here I just have different equivalent and relative forms. These are all taken directly from Marx in these first chapters. Equivalent, you have a coat, 10 pounds of tea, 40 pounds of linen, 40 pounds of coffee. These are all equivalent, relative to, or equivalent to 20 yards of linen. You put the linen in here, and then you have all of these things, same amounts, right? Because they're all equal to each other. You can all express that then, you make that equal to 2 ounces of gold, which becomes the universal equivalent, but people don't just carry around gold in their pockets. We need something else, we need money, so we take that 2 ounces of gold, put it in an equivalency relationship, because it is also a commodity, and express its value and the value of all of these other things with X amount of money, and that is what money is. Okay, and I've just made this graph, or a little, not a graph really, but a picture, to try to help to explain some of what's going on here, okay? So, here's us, here's a capitalist, or here's two people, it doesn't matter. We're all engaged in capitalism, the buying and selling of commodities, and so we see these things, and we buy a house, we buy a smartphone or a shirt, and we give some money for it, and we see these things, and we think, oh, this is the economy, okay? This is what we see. But these are just forms, right? Because what they really mask is the reality, which is a social relationship where the value of these things is expressed, where it's produced by the surplus labor of workers who work under specific social, socio-historical, and material conditions. They give their labor power, they sell it as a commodity, which has a distinct amount of value, to the capitalist, and he or she pays them wages in return. Okay, but we don't see this. We just see these forms. And we think, oh, this is great, this is the economy, but it's not. Because we're missing the social reality. Okay? Okay, and then he starts to talk about exchange. So social relations are mediated through the exchange of commodities and their values expressed in money, as we talked about. And money is both a commodity, could be gold, silver, whatever, and it's also the money form, an expression of the value of all other commodities. So Marx says, the act of exchange gives to the commodity converted into money not its value, but its specific value form. Okay? By confounding these two distinct things, some writers have been led to hold that the value of gold and silver is imaginary, which is not. Neither is money just a symbol. The money form is, quote, simply the form under which certain social relations manifest themselves. What we just saw in that previous image that I created. This is also not simply a mere fiction. The value represented by the value form, for instance, money, represents or hides the real unequal social relations which reflect the dominant modes of production, and there is nothing natural about it. So, anyway, Marx is preoccupied with these forms. Anyway, he's going on with all these money form, value form, yada yada form. What is all this stuff? It seems unnecessary, confusing. Why form, form, form? Because Marx is trying to point out that the forms themselves are just bullshit. People see an object, a commodity, and they say, oh, a thing, or money, and they say, oh, money. But they aren't really those things. Those are just the forms of something else, of what they represent. We've seen how these things are already in an equivalency relationship, so we can imagine quite easily now how they're just representing something else, right? Or better, of what they hide. And what they really hide is the labor that produced them and the underlying unequal social relations and conditions upon which that labor is based, namely the relationship between labor and capitalist, i.e. the wage relationship. Not to mention a host of other terrible things concealed by the supposed, quote, free exchange of commodities, namely alienation, which consists of three types. The first between the individual and the self, the second between individual or society and the individual, and the third between man and nature. The breakdown of traditional communal bonds, because all interactions are mediated on the market, i.e. the buying and selling of commodities, environmental destruction, etc. Let's look at money in Chapter 3, money or the circulation of commodities. Marx next looks at how capitalism reproduces itself through circulation. He starts with the commodity, its exchange for money, and the use of this to buy another commodity. Hey, that's pretty simple, right? It's the metamorphosis of commodities, CMC. Probably some of you have heard this if you've gotten through the first few chapters of Capital. And Marx's great example that he gives is Linen Money Bible. He later adds whiskey after this. Linen Money Bible whiskey or something, or money whiskey, or money brandy, yeah. But on and on, right? You buy, you sell. Hey, simple stuff. But really, the process starts with money because you got to have something to buy, labor power, a commodity, the most important commodity with first, right? So the formula is really MCM, which establishes circulation of commodities, a whole, quote, network of social relations. So the M in CMC is just the medium of circulation of commodities. The amount of money in circulation is supposed to equate to the sum of prices of all commodities in circulation. So if there's a rise in prices, then accordingly there will be a rise in the money circulating. The point is that the amount of money determines commodities' prices and value, and the money supply equals the time to complete circulation. So money equals the sum of prices, the sum of the prices of all commodities divided by the number of moves made during a specific time. Money has a, quote, purely symbolic character because it is supposed to represent gold, but actually anything can become a currency as long as it is agreed upon, i.e. it has, quote, social validity. And now we start getting into Chapter 4, the general formula for capital. And he says, the circulation of commodities, which we've seen MCM, is the starting point of capital. The final result is more money than was originally put in, i.e. surplus value, i.e. increased capital. That makes sense, right? I mean, even if you're just looking at exchange, which still basically is here, which is buy low, sell high, right? Or you make a profit, you invest some, you take out a little more, right? I mean, that's pretty easy stuff. That's the goal of capitalism, after all, to reproduce itself, to make more capital. And capital first takes the form of money. MCM is buying to sell, and as I just mentioned, with the end aim of profit. Whereas the end aim of CMC is consumption, i.e. The obtaining of a use value. But the end aim of MCM is exchange value, and the whole process is an expansion of value with, quote, no limits. The possessor of M becomes a capitalist, who is, quote, capital personified and endowed with a consciousness and a will. So, Marx makes many interesting observations which kind of confound traditional ideas of leftism or Marxism in this throughout Capital. And there's a traditional idea of class conflict and proletariat overthrowing the capitalists to get rid of capitalism, for instance, which has existed throughout much of modern history. But if we really think about the meaning of this, that the capitalist is simply not endowed with a will themselves, but is simply capital personified. So capital acts through them to carry out its will. The aim of capital in circulation of commodities, MCM, is the expansion of capital, to withdraw more money from circulation at the end that was put in at the start. Quote, this increment or excess over the original value I call surplus value, and I will abbreviate this later hereafter as S. This is a key term, probably certainly one of the key terms of capital. The value originally advanced, therefore, not only remains intact while in circulation, but adds to itself a surplus value or expands itself. Obviously, right? Because you take out more money than you put in if you're being a successful capitalist. It is this movement that converts it into capital. And then he goes on in Chapter 5 to look at some contradictions in the general formula of capital. The important caveat is that while MCM is the starting point of capital, as he says, the formula itself, quote, begets no value, i.e. surplus value doesn't just come from buying and selling commodities. This is what he's arguing against, right? This he's saying that it doesn't come from circulation, i.e. buying cheap and selling dear. Because if one buys high and the other sells low, the prices of values of money in circulation still equal out, and or they don't change. I.e. the circulation of commodities or capital is only one way to increase capital, but not value itself. Even if $40 and $50 change hands, it still adds up to $90. So now we get on to one of the key points of these first chapters. To create value and surplus value, the capitalist needs a source of universal use value that also creates value, because this can't just come from the sphere of circulation. This source is labor power. The worker has no other commodity to sell but his or her labor power. Note that for the capitalist, thus, workers' labor power is also a use value. This relationship is not a natural state, but rather it is socio-historically specific to the capitalist mode of production. Also, just CMC or even MCM does not equal capitalism. It is only when the worker is compelled to sell his or her labor power as a commodity on the market, i.e. the wage relationship, that the capitalist mode of production emerges. The value of labor power is determined, as we've seen, by socially necessary labor time, and labor power is to the capitalist a use value. This use value is advanced to the capitalist as credit, since the capitalist knows the total value of the labor power, but only pays for the portion of it that is expended during a certain part of the working day, and this is wages. Okay, now we get into the real deal stuff here. The labor process and the process of producing surplus value. The key point is that labor produces more value, i.e. surplus value. It is the only commodity that produces more value than is put into it. That's where value comes from. One portion of the working day, and thus labor power expended by the worker, is necessary for the worker's own social reproduction, i.e. to pay for his daily subsistence. But the rest of the day is surplus labor time. Over and above this, the worker is paid only for a portion of the day that is necessary for his or her social reproduction, but the rest goes unpaid. Thus, this is how labor power functions as a source of surplus value for the capitalist. So it sounds pretty simple, right? They're putting in labor power with a certain amount of value, but they only get a portion of that in wages, and the rest of it goes to the capitalist. That's pretty much it. That's surplus value. But it gets a little bit more complicated as Marx makes this argument going on, but the basic essence of it is this, okay? And he says, therefore, the value of labor power and the value which that labor power creates in the labor process are two entirely different magnitudes. And this difference of the two values was what the capitalist had in view when he was purchasing labor power. What really influenced him was the specific use value which this commodity possesses, of being a source not only of value, but of more value than it has itself. So, surplus value equals the source of capital, and this is produced not in the sphere of circulation, but in the sphere of production. So if we wanted to add to that simple MCM formula before, it might look something like this. You start with money. The capitalist invests a certain amount of money to make commodity 1, which is created through the expansion of partly labor power. And this is, money buys the first commodity, which is labor power of the workers. Plus, then, this is used to produce commodity 2, which is the product being made. But in this process, surplus value here is also created to yield more money than is originally put in. So if you want to complicate this MCM simple formula a little bit, it might look something like this, okay? And then Marx goes on to give more detail about different kinds of capital, and the main two being constant capital and variable capital. The two main kinds of capital, constant capital and variable capital. Basically, C is capital. I abbreviate these, by the way, as C and V. I put them in parentheses. You don't have to put them in parentheses, obviously. Marx does not, but it's rather confusing in a jumble of text in a paragraph to just have a letter C suddenly appear. so I put it in parentheses so that it's easier to read. Basically, C, constant capital, is capital spent on fixed things. For example, the means of production, machinery, tools, technology, etc. Whereas variable capital essentially refers to capital set aside for labor, for example, to pay workers' wages, especially. So it can be greatly simplified as constant capital equals capital invested in the means of production, and variable capital equals capital invested in labor, wages. You have to buy some machines to make something, and then you have to hire some people, right? Now, each of these, of course, imparts value to the commodity. Constant capital imparts a portion of its overall value, the amount of capital invested to buy machinery, into each commodity through wear and tear. Machines make things. They expend a part of themselves in the process. They don't last forever. So a part of that original value that was invested in them, their value decreases, obviously, right? And that is imparted to the individual commodities it makes. Meanwhile, variable capital equals labor power yields surplus value, as we have seen. But overall surplus value and capital extracted in the production process must therefore be a subtraction of capital invested initially in both C and V, so that surplus value equals the value of capital minus the value of the constant capital plus the value of the variable capital. And I'll explain this more later. New technology affects the price of constant capital since machines cost more money to buy, right? New computer comes out, costs a lot of money. The previous version before that, now rendered old, its price goes down. Doesn't cost as much money, right? That's how technology works. But at the same time, as the price of C rises, the price of V, labor power, will go down. For example, what was once produced by lots of workers is now produced by fast, high-tech machines. Okay, so new technology comes out and it doesn't require as many workers to make something anymore. So the price of V goes down, but that machinery is expensive. So the price of that C, that constant capital, goes up. But this will also affect the amount of surplus value extracted in the entire production process, as well as the price of the commodities. And then Marx starts to talk about the rate of surplus value. How do we calculate the rate of surplus value? How do we know how much and at what rate is being created? And he says that capital, here abbreviated as a large capital C. I realize this is confusing. Marx variously refers to capital and commodities abbreviated as C throughout. I try to use different abbreviations for all of them, but capital here means is with a capital C. So capital equals constant capital plus variable capital, but that extra surplus value is added in the production so that capital actually equals constant value plus variable capital plus surplus value. So for example, start with $500, and this yields, and this is spent out in the way, or divided out, $410 for constant capital, $90 for variable capital, and then it yields $90 through surplus value. Through the process, $500 in capital becomes $590. It's just the surplus value part that's added on. The difference is a surplus value of $90. But while C imparts a portion of its value, e.g. the labor power embodied in linen is expressed in the coat, it does not add any new value to the new commodity, right? Machines, they express a part of their value to the commodities that they make, but they're not creating new value, right? That makes sense. Its value, cost or expenses for the capitalist, is a given constant capital, right? So it's subtracted from the overall profits. So in our equation of calculating only new value added through labor power, we actually equate C with 0. For example, variable capital plus surplus capital, then this is 90 plus 90, for instance, would be $180. Then we want to determine the rate of surplus value. So this is just then surplus value divided by variable capital, or 90 divided by 90, expressed as a percent, is 100%. And next we distinguish necessary labor time, which is the time needed to reproduce the capital advanced for V, so say 3 hours of a 6-hour working day, and surplus labor time, which is the rest of the day, where surplus value is produced. For instance, the remaining 3 hours are all surplus labor time, which produce surplus value. So the rate of surplus value, abbreviated by me here after, is as ROS, is an quote, exact expression for the degree of exploitation of labor power by capital. This is important because this is expressly where Marx differs from all other previous classical economists before him, and where Capital, his work really forms a critique of political economy, right? So then Marx looks at the working day, and he mainly examines the rate of surplus value and the degree of exploitation as a function of time. So if a laborer works 30 years on average, then the labor power for each day will equal 1 divided by 365 times 30, or expressed as a fraction like this, 1 out of 1,095 of its value. But no capitalist actually pays this amount, right? Because they know the average amount that someone's probably going to work and how much value they're going to produce in that time, because they know the set value of the commodities they're producing and how much they're investing initially in capital in C and V. So they can figure this out, right? They could pay that each day then, right? Just like this. But no capitalist actually pays this amount. Instead, the capitalist tries to consume this share in a shorter amount of time, right? That makes sense. You want to get this in as much time as possible. Thus, labor power is also a function of time. And class struggle largely then becomes a struggle over time. And Marx details this with many examples of the horrible labor conditions in English factories, especially child labor. And he also examines the effects of the Factory Acts, which were, being released just prior to this time and during his time. In all of these examples, exploitation is a function of time, because the Factory Acts first set limits on the working day. They determine how many hours people, workers, and children can work legally. So the first English Factory Act acts between 1833 and 1864. In 1833, this one set hours on the working day. Youth were limited to 12 hours of work. Time for meals must be provided. Kids under 9 were not allowed to work, and kids could only work a max of 8 hours. The laws were very lenient to capitalists, but capitalists still pushed back more, and moreover, it was very difficult to enforce those laws. This was followed by, in 1844, by revisions to the Factory Act, which limit work hours for women. And kids under 13 could only work then 6.5 hours max. In 1948, the Factory Act set the workday at 10 hours, and capitalists responded by lowering wages. But workers supported less hours. The 10-hour, this was abbreviated as, or commonly called the 10 Hours Act of 1848. But manufacturers adopted the relay system in response, where workers would work for shifts which total more than 10 hours. They would work for a short shift and say, okay, less than 10 hours, take a break, come back and work again. But short break, and in total they're working way more than 10 hours. Also, others worked during their breaks to keep the machines going. And in 1850, the Factory Act ended this relay system. So Marx says, quote, "The creation of a normal working day is, therefore, the product of a protracted civil war more or less dissembled between the capitalist class and the working class." And Marx ends the chapter by proposing that workers come together to pass a law which prohibits the selling of labor power in general, and thus would end the capitalist mode of production. I want to point out, incidentally, that this is the only point in Capital that I have found where Marx explicitly lays out a very specific suggestion that could be enacted within the capitalist system for how to end or limit capitalist modes of production. He doesn't go into detail on this, unfortunately, but it is quite interesting, make a law that prohibits the buying and selling of labor power. And then he looks at the rate and the mass of surplus value. So the value of labor power equals the cost divided by the part of the working day necessary for the worker to sustain his or her own reproduction, the cost of living and food and expenses, for instance. So if there's a 6-hour work day and the variable capital is $20 for that day and the rate of surplus value is $100, then that labor power is going to yield a surplus value of $20. But this is just for one worker. So it must be multiplied by the number of workers employed by the capitalist to find the total mass. For example, if there's 100 workers, then the mass of that surplus value in this example would be $2,000. And the total variable capital, which must be advanced by the capitalist for a given workday. And that $2,000 would yield $2,000 in surplus value. And so the mass of surplus value equals variable capital times the rate of surplus value. This number of workers directly relates to the amount of surplus value created, even though a higher value with more people, even though there's a higher variable capital with more people to pay. And that capital compels the working class to work beyond what is necessary for their own social reproduction. Now, we'll get into this more in later lectures, but capital and surplus value can only be created by labor power. So the lower C that you have relatively inexpensive means of production and technology, machines, whatever, and you have a lot of people working very hard for long hours, for low wages. That is the best situation for creating surplus value for the capitalist, and it has the highest rate of surplus value, the highest mass of surplus value, even if those individual commodities it makes are quite cheap and the overall wealth and the overall capital remains low. The rate of exploitation and of surplus value will be very high because it's a function of C to V. And the concept of relative surplus value. How to get more surplus value if the value of labor power and length of the workday is fixed? Well, the answer is you need to shorten the time for the necessary labor, the cost of labor power to reproduce itself, and lengthen the surplus labor time. You could pay less, of course, but this assumes that workers can live on less and thus presupposes a general decline in the value of labor power. Problematic. Or you could increase productivity. This is another common method. You could make 2 times as much in the same amount of time. Making the working day longer equals absolute surplus value, but keeping the same time and producing more faster, making things more productive, quote, equals a faster relative surplus time. And this is how you make more S in a shorter amount of time. And to make the total value of labor power fall, the cost of commodities in key industries, i.e. the commodities that are necessary for workers' social reproduction, basic food staples, etc., must also fall. For example, the productive technology must be revolutionized so that key commodities can be made cheaper and quicker. In this way, the value of labor power and so the cost of variable capital, i.e. workers, can also be lowered. This is why Marx says the value of commodities is in inverse ratio to the productiveness of labor. So the capitalist makes 2 times as much in the same time as before to increase surplus value by increasing productivity. Now, each commodity is worth a fraction, so let's say 1/2 of what it formerly was, because if it's 2 times. But or so to realize one day of labor, the value of 1 day of labor, the capitalist now has to sell 2 times as many goods. This predicates increased demand. Also, this new form of surplus value is only valid when the individual capitalist has a monopoly on productivity, i.e. through access to new technology, etc., he or she can sell below the price of other similar commodities. Once it is generalized, this source of surplus value vanishes. Right? So get access to new machines, new technology first. That's how you can extract that little bit of surplus value in a shorter amount of time. But once everybody owns that technology, that advantage disappears. So the capitalist or capital doesn't seek to shorten the working day, but rather just the portion of necessary labor time versus surplus labor time. And then Marx talks about cooperation. The capitalist mode of production also begins a process of social production by bringing disparate individual workers into contact to work on common production of goods, i.e. capitalism thus sets the stage for A, its own undoing, and B, later, more advanced stages of production, namely socialism. This is important, and it's part of what I would term Marx's accelerationism. That capitalism, in his view, at least expressed in Capital, and some would say he expresses a different view, a teleological view of history in his later writings, but just looking at Capital, it seems that he very clearly does say that capitalism sets the stage for its own demise and for more advanced forms of production. Now, I would argue advanced forms of production here does not necessarily mean capitalist forms of production, of course. It doesn't have to mean environmentally destructive forms. It could mean advance in a sense of a higher stage of social production. And this is what I think he really means. But anyway, he says, when the laborer cooperates systematically with others, he strips off the fetters of his individuality and develops the capability of his species. So people are coming together to work together for a common purpose. And that is what is important for Marx. In capitalism, people come together for a common purpose, but then they just make mundane things that we don't really need, and that but we feel like we're compelled to buy, for instance, right? Marx says that is what we want to get rid of. But this working together for a common purpose, this is actually important, and this is something that we want to keep. This is the view he expresses in Capital. I think it is the correct view, the correct way to read Marx and what he's really trying to say. Cooperation thus is the key to species being. It is necessary for capital, but it also gives workers more power to push back against capital by bringing them into contact with each other and into conflict with capital. Okay, and then he looks at the division of labor in manufacture. So people are brought together, but they're working for a common purpose, but they all do different things. So this is specialization and the division of labor. Specialization is where formerly different independent craftsmen are joined together into one factory, but now they all just make separate elements of one product, and they lose the knowledge or skills of their old professions. They're together, yet they are isolated at the same time through the division of labor. The different processes of manufacture happen simultaneously rather than in order, so to save time. Right? It's not step 1, step 2, step 3. No, they're all happening at the same time. Specialization and division of labor are based on skills, so that one worker no longer possesses all of the skills necessary to make something. Rather, those skills are divided over many people. So people are then divided into a hierarchy of more skilled to less skilled with different values and different pay, and the introduction of unskilled workers who previously were excluded from handicrafts. Division of labor thus divides into separate vocations, and it also mirrors the division between town and country more generally. There's also a, quote, territorial division of labor, where one region specializes in one good used to make a larger product. Marx was critical of the division of labor because it impoverishes men by stripping them of their other skills, and Adam Smith also realized that the division of labor was detrimental to human self-development, which is why he advocated state-led education. And put quite simply, this is why we have schools. At least in capitalism, right? Overall, men learning many skills makes them less exploitable by the division of labor and capital in general. And then Marx looks at machinery and modern industry. The key point is that capitalist technology doesn't make our lives easier or shorten the working day. Rather, its goal is to make commodities cheaper and to shorten the part of the working day the laborer works for himself, i.e. variable capital, i.e. wages, and lengthen the other portion, i.e. relative surplus labor time. In short, technology is, quote, a means for producing surplus value. This already answers a lot of questions about contemporary problems that we have under capitalism and why for instance, each time a new computer or a new smartphone comes out, our lives, it actually doesn't make our lives any simpler and we feel like we're just working more. Right? It's just one more thing to do, one more social networking site to register with, one more thing that we have to input, one more place we have to import our data, right? Doesn't make our lives easier because that's not the purpose of technology under capitalism. New technology requires a new power source, i.e., quote, a prime mover. Renewables like water power are not reliable because they can't run all the time at a constant speed and output, and also the water source is not movable to cities. So new prime mover is required, and this, in Marx's time, was fulfilled by the steam engine, and coal were adopted. Now, Andres Malm goes into great detail of this history, the connections between the advent of capitalism and coal power, and the use of fossil fuels, and the origins of our contemporary climate catastrophe. and I have another video lecture about his book. This is most suited to constant mechanical industry and urban centers. I just want to check and see if I actually am recording. Okay, good. Can never be too certain. You know, you get really far into a lecture and then realize you weren't recording this whole time. So looks like I am, so I guess we're good and we'll continue. The difference between a tool and a machine is that the motive power is different. Man uses tools and thus is the motive power. But for machines, they require a motive force that comes from elsewhere, i.e. generated energy. Once one mode of production has been reformed to capitalist relations, this spurs new inventions in the means of production. And once manufacture of one commodity has been mechanized, so it requires others to be mechanized as well, i.e. market imperatives, and this relates to socially necessary labor time. Machines beget machines, in other words, while workers in the process are, quote, mere appendages. Machines themselves produce no new value, as we've shown. Rather, they are a kind of constant capital, which impart a portion of their value to the commodities. They never add more value than it loses. Also, the value of a prime mover, for instance coal, the energy behind the machine, is transferred to the commodity as well as it is expended. This is where the prices of energy come into play. Machines produce more, so there's more total value, but the value of each commodity produced is less. Thus, they make the prices of commodities cheaper. But this also reduces the price of staple commodities, which means there's lower wages and then cheaper labor power. And so, it makes machines less competitive vis-a-vis labor. Again, now there's this tension then between C and V, right? Because it's all a relationship between C and V. How much do you invest, how much capital do you invest in C, and how much do you invest in V? And only V can create more surplus labor. Again, so you don't want to spend too much on constant capital, okay? So whether the capitalist incorporates new tech depends on whether it is cheaper at the time. It depends on which is cheaper at the time, machines or labor power. And this is why Marx says the Yankees have invented a stone-breaking machine. The English do not make use of it because the wretch who does this work gets paid for such a small portion of his labor that machinery would increase the cost of production to the capitalist. Continuing on with this chapter, some effects of technology. Note, some of these are contradictory and not always simultaneous. One is that it brings more workers into the workplace, namely women and children in Marx's day, and thus lowers the value of labor power, i.e. wages in general. And this is the increased proletarialization, in other words, lowers the value of labor power. How? One way is that previously grueling heavy labor is now easier to do with the use of machines, and skilled labor becomes unskilled labor. So the value of labor power of one worker previously spread across is now spread across a whole family, thus reducing the value of labor power. The capitalist now gets 4 times the amount of labor power and surplus value for about the same amount. Another is the lengthening of the working day. A new tech would lengthen the working day? Really? How? I thought new tech was supposed to liberate us and we'll never have to work again, right? Not exactly. New tech costs a lot of money, i.e. constant capital. Plus it gets obsolete fast once newer tech comes out. So the capitalist has to work it fast and hard over a short amount of time. Lost time equals lost money. But there's a contradiction, and this is explained in more detail later. Technology eventually reduces the total number of workers necessary to do a job, yet it can't increase surplus value with just new tech, with C alone. This can only be done with labor power. So tech tries to make up for this by lengthening the working day. And a third is an increase in the degree of exploitation, i.e. The, quote, intensification of labor. New tech makes more faster and with less workers. For example, one worker can now do the job of 2 in half the time. But less workers equals less surplus value. So the capitalist pushes fewer workers to work harder in a shorter amount of time. This is the lengthening of the portion of the day that the worker produces S for the capitalist, i.e. an increase in relative surplus value. This has important implications for workers' attempts to shorten the working day. Marx shows that with the Factory Acts, limits on the workday were set, but this actually increased the level of exploitation through an increase in, quote, productivity. And going on. It's a pretty long chapter, actually. More effects of new technology machines. Before, man used the means of production as his tools, but now the means of production, machines, use man as their tools, and the work is deprived of all interest and meaning. The capitalist also has means of suppressing the worker, reducing wages, and replacing the worker altogether. Or for the capitalist, tech gives the capitalist this ability. Machines raise outputs and cheapen the cost of commodities, but they also raise the demand for raw materials. And in a later lecture, we'll look at this in more detail, but here is the link between English factory cotton mill weavers and the looms that came out in this big cotton boom, and U.S. slave labor, which was used to supply cotton, the cotton used in English manufacturing. So the immediate result of machines is more surplus labor. Technology can result in new jobs and industries, but these jobs are totally dependent on market demands. Once the technology changes, the workers in these industries might now be out of a job, or even worse, out of house and home. And moreover, those out of work are reduced to the lowest possible social existence because they've never received training for anything else and society doesn't provide for their needs. New tech spurs investment and accelerates accumulation, and also the quest for more raw materials spurs colonization or imperialism, neo-imperialism. Again, tech replaces once skilled labor, high paid, with unskilled, cheap labor. The advance of tech, so technology advances when traditional or prior methods have reached max surplus value extraction. New tech makes old tech cheaper, and so the popular masses of people, everybody then can buy the old tech, but only new tech can really be used to produce surplus value. And only the richest capitalists can afford the newest tech. Note that the Factory Acts required more surplus labor in a shorter amount of time, so this results in the centralization of capital around the richest capitalists who can afford newer tech and bigger factories, whereas smaller businesses and manufacturers are gradually run out of business. The sudden demand causes a surge in orders as well, and this can cause overwork. But with the declining demand, there's a layoff in workers. So workers are either overworked or starved for work, neither being good situations. But the capitalist is not affected by this. Rather, out of work or irregular workers is to his benefit because this forms what Marx calls the reserve army of labor. I'll skip a little bit, but division of labor is thus totally dependent on the whims of capital, but it has major repercussions for society, namely who works when, where, and how. And because the division of labor changes over time, there's a need to train the reserve army and future workers for a variety of professions, thus another function of school. Capitalism destroys the old family bonds and patriarchy by bringing, for example, women into the workplace and the proletariatization of women. It enables them in ways that they perhaps had not been before. This is not all bad. Equal work also means you have to recognize some level of equal rights. And future society, says Marx, will do away with the old family structure, hierarchical family structure, patriarchy for instance, but also with capitalist exploitation under the division of labor. Okay. And tech had also a huge effect on agriculture, as we'll see more in later lectures as well, because it destroyed the old peasant farmer and replaced it with the modern wage labor. It displaced the peasant farmer and then concentrated these workers in cities and they provided a new reserve army of labor and the basis for modern industrial manufacturing. This had numerous effects. One, it concentrated the historical motive power of society, i.e. the proletariat. Two, it broke the natural metabolism with the soil, with land and nature. This is touching on the metabolic rift that Marx became much interested in later years. Marx refers to this, by the way, as robbing the soil. But it also makes people aware of the need to restore and fix this rift, much as in the same way that we're now very painfully aware of the need to solve climate change by getting rid of capitalism. And then Marx looks in more detail at the production of absolute and relative surplus value. And we've basically already talked about this, but this just kind of illustrates it a little bit. If there's a working day of 8 hours, for example, this could be divided into 3 hours necessary labor, or absolute surplus value. This is the labor that gets paid. The worker gets paid this amount in wages, and those wages are used to buy the necessities of life, food and clothes and house and whatever. And then the other 5 hours is all surplus labor, or relative surplus value. And if you change these amounts, right, if you have an 8-hour working day at a 3-to-5 ratio like this, based on different calculations of constant capital to variable capital and surplus value, you would come out with something like a rate of surplus value, S divided by V, of 125%. But if you change this so that now it's 2 hours necessary labor time and 5 hours of surplus labor, if you make something, quote, more productive, here's how you get a higher rate of surplus value. Now you can up that to 250%. This also makes a difference with how much capital you invest in the process initially. Chapter 17, more productivity equals shorter but more intense workday. But Marx portrays this potentially as a good thing, contingent on the eventual abolition of the capitalist mode of production, because eventually work would or will reach an equilibrium spread out among members of society where everyone has to work a little and the rest is spare or free time. And this is Marx's definition of communism in Capital. So communism equals basically free time. And he says, the intensity and productiveness of labor being given, the time which society is bound to devote to material production is shorter, and as a consequence, the time at its disposal for the free development, intellectual and social, of the individual is greater. In proportion as the work is more and more evenly divided among all the able-bodied members of society, and as a particular class is more and more deprived of the power to shift the natural burden of labor from its own shoulders to those of another layer of society. Wow, this is all one sentence. In this direction, the shortening of the working day finds at last a limit in the generalization of labor. In capitalist society, spare time is acquired for one class by converting the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time. In Chapter 19, he looks at the transformation of the value, and respectively the price, of labor power into wages. Labor is a measure of value, but it has no value itself. Labor power has value. So the value of labor power determines the value of labor, which is expressed in money or price. Why is this important? Because, quote, the value of labor must always be less than the value it produces. Okay, so there's a slight distinction here between labor and labor power. Okay, so let's say there's an 8-hour working day again. 4 hours of this is necessary labor time, necessary for the worker's reproduction. This equals, let's say, $36 at $9 an hour. And then the rest, equally split down the middle, is 4 hours surplus labor with a surplus value of also $36. So the whole day yields a value of $72, but the value paid to the worker's wages is only $36 for that day. So the capitalist always pays under the full value produced by labor power. Only a portion of this value is paid as wages. This is why Marx insists that price does not equal value, does not equal wages in, quote, vulgar political economy. If the actual value of labor existed, thus, there would be no capital or surplus value. Okay, now we get into the accumulation of capital. And in the class I'm teaching this semester, this is one area that I really want to focus on. We're moving along actually quite well here. So nearing the end of Capital Volume 1, getting into some very important points. The laborer pays his wages with his own labor. Only a portion of the product of his labor is returned to the laborer. The capitalist advances capital, for example, $1,000. If $200 surplus value is realized then per year, then in 5 years, the capitalist has regained the original 1,000 advanced. But this is not literally the same capital, right? Because MCM, it's this continuous circuit, and you put in 1,000 at the beginning, but then you sell and you pay wages and you do all this stuff and you get more surplus value, and after 5 years, you've got extra money. But it's not the same money, literally, that you put in, right? Rather, it's the sum of surplus values of new capital. So all capital eventually becomes accumulated capital. But what is the starting point of the circulation accumulation process? In other words, where does the original M come from? It results from an original separation of the worker from A, the products of his labor, and B, the means of production. The worker thus has no way to support his own reproduction, but to sell his own labor power as a commodity to the capitalist, who allows him to access the means of production and enables him to buy back his own products at a fraction of their true value in the form of wages. Okay, this is how capitalism works, right? It sounds ridiculous when you explicitly try to articulate it, but this is literally what is happening all the time. The alienation of worker from A and B, these A and B therefore, gives rise to the wage relationship, which forms the basis of capitalist relations and production. Note that the capitalist benefits dually from this process because 1, she gets surplus value from the labor power, and 2, the worker uses wages to buy more goods and commodities and to reproduce himself. For example, to regain his physical strength or to give birth to more workers, etc. Chapter 24, the conversion of surplus value into capital. So the most indispensable means of production is the laborer himself. Quote, the maintenance and reproduction of the working class is and must ever be a necessary condition to the reproduction of capital. So again, I don't know what this means for traditional ideas of class struggle and the working class taking over the means of production, but Marx clearly states that it's not just that. The laborer is the most important means of production. This is a relationship, a social relationship that we're talking about reforming. It's not just taking over a machine in a factory, right? Capital begets more capital. Thus, the more capital has accumulated, the more it is able to accumulate. New capital as surplus value is used to produce more capital and surplus value, and so on and so forth. This is like building a building. Builders actually build it, but it belongs to the capitalist. Property laws thus enshrine alienation and capitalist relations. While capital robs the worker not only of their products, builders usually don't actually use the buildings, but also of the surplus value, which is then used to acquire more labor power equals surplus value equals capital. Moreover, the building itself is used to enshrine capitalist relations. Say that it's an office building, and thus it's overseen by a company who exploits surplus value from its workers while paying rent to a capitalist who advances capital to build more buildings. Capital accumulation thus creates the conditions for future society, though, because capital is robbery, but Marx also explains it as, quote, a part of social wealth. The social wealth itself is being increased. Of course, this is because capital accumulation is built from the collective surplus value over long periods of time. So here is a visualization of how the accumulation of capital might look. This is my idea. I don't know if it's the best idea or not. I'm just trying to visualize what Marx is saying here because actually it can get a little bit confusing. You have a first generation of workers and they start this process. They sell their labor power. It's bought with money. They sell their labor power. It starts the process of MCM and it yields more commodities which are used to buy more, which are sold and yield more money and etc. and create surplus value in this product. So capital itself is accumulating through the CMC process, which is repeating and repeating through successive generations of workers over a given amount of time, okay? And I want to add then that wages themselves are an advance made, set aside as a part of variable capital, and that wages of earlier successive workers are used, the surplus value is used to pay the wages of then successive generations, right? The requirement of accumulation is the need for more workers, growth, for instance. And this predicates also rising wages, as well as workers' enslavement to capital. The capitalist understands this logic. To grow, capitalism needs an industrious poor who work hard and spend all their savings. Wages and work hours rise and fall, but it can't threaten that part of the day which is relative surplus value. Where did my laser pointer go? Ooh. Sorry. Rising wages may cause capital acceleration to slow, which eventually would lead the capitalist to invest less in variable capital, or acceleration may increase or speed up, but it still leads to smaller profits and ergo eventually wages. Either way, the rate of accumulation is independent and wages are the dependent variable. Capital shifts and drops and adds workers, and wages rise and fall according to its needs. And again, here is capital. The accumulation of capital equals all of this unpaid labor, whereas wages is just the part paid. So accumulation, growth over S, and the rise of wages results in the rise of wages, i.e. variable capital, because this part is necessary for surplus value. But it can never rise so much that it threatens the unpaid part of the working day, i.e. surplus labor time, and will only rise enough to perpetuate the capitalist system. Productivity arises from an increase in C in proportion to V. In the process of accumulation, the V decreases in proportion to C as C grows. Growth, therefore, equals more capitalists, but no or little growth equals fewer capitalists, i.e. more centralization. Acceleration, therefore, equals concentration and centralization. Note, growth is a part of this, especially in early stages. Concentration means that past and continuing acceleration come under the control of fewer capitalists, and this is also then centralization. It is the, quote, concentration of capitals already formed. Thus, this is not limited by social growth because it just is a changing of hands. So it's still accumulation and concentration. Marx says capital grows in one place to a huge mass in a single hand because it has in another place been lost by many. Again, this results largely from more productivity and advances in tech, machinery, etc., increasing C, and producing cheaper commodities than others. Credit plays a big part in this too, because credit is, quote, an enormous social mechanism for the centralization of capitals. Centralization is an inevitable process and the end of accumulation and concentration, because more and more capital is necessary to meet or produce for the increased demand. Only centralization can handle mass production and mass needs. Note, Marx doesn't portray this as a bad thing. It is part of the process of, quote, the production of socially combined and scientifically arranged. Need a drink of water. And more centralization equals more or higher C and reduced demand for V, i.e. as the production process becomes more automated and mechanized with higher tech, there's less need for workers. This is what we've talked about, right? With centralization and accumulation, C increased much more in proportion to V. This means that even while the population of workers may increase, there is always a portion that is rendered redundant, i.e. a surplus population or a reserve army of labor unemployed. Whenever there are great fluctuations in C, for example, with the release of a new invention or a new piece of technology, there's always a great fluctuation in V too. And the industrial reserve army is necessary then to respond to the fluctuations in capital and constant capital. They help respond to capital's expansion and contraction. So why is there homelessness? Why is there poverty? Why is there unemployment? Especially, it's all necessary under capitalism, right? And here again is the accumulation of capital, again looking at it in the spiral. Marx actually refers to it as a spiral in Capital, and this is why I've depicted it in such a way. You start out at the beginning of the process, and this is really important for the historical process of the accumulation of capital, which is one of the main focuses of this course, okay? So you start out with a large amount of labor power in V, and a small amount of capital or money. And then this accumulates, and you get more and more capital, And as you go through the process, you invest more of that capital in higher tech. You buy new machines, but then you need less workers. You're still accumulating more wealth, but the ratio of V to C is changed, so that toward the end, you have a small amount of V and a large amount of C. So the rate of surplus value starts out high here, but it continually goes down throughout this process as C grows in proportion to V. Once C and capital grow to a certain endpoint of accumulation relative to V in a certain industry, then the acceleration of capital must be accumulated capital must be reinvested elsewhere. This relates to the falling rate of profit discussed later, because only labor power and surplus value can create value. Therefore, as industries shed V in relation to C throughout the accumulation process, they eventually reach an endpoint of overaccumulation, and this is one of the ways Marx explains why there are crises in capitalism. At this point, capital must be reinvested elsewhere, i.e. in a new industry, for example. This creates renewed demand for V, thus utilizing the industrial reserve army, and thus the effects in their turn become causes. Also, increased V doesn't necessarily mean more workers. It could just mean more labor power from the same number or even fewer workers. In this case, though, there's still an increase in wages and ergo an increase in V. And replacing more skilled or fewer workers with less skilled or more workers, for instance, and more productivity would equal fewer workers who produce more S. This results in more industrial reserve army and thus lower wages. So it's this constant back and forth, right? Tug of war. The overwork of the employed part of the working class swells the ranks of the reserve, whilst conversely, the greater pressure that the latter, by its competition, exerts on the former, forces these to submit to overwork and to subjugation under the dictates of capital. So contraction in capital and the size of the industrial reserve army determines wages, not the size of the population in general, nor the growth of capital. So workers and capital create their own conditions for the industrial reserve army and unemployment. The harder they work, the more accumulation and surplus value there are, the more redundant they eventually render themselves, at least in a certain sector. Wages may rise, but never too much, because there will always be an industrial reserve army. And here's this process, then, of overaccumulation resulting in crises, and then possibly that extra capital, which then has reached an endpoint, being invested somewhere else in a new industry in Sector 2, for instance. The key point is that C is always greater than V, and thus there will always be an industrial reserve army. There are three phases to this: floating, latent, and stagnant, says Marx. The floating is moving from one industry, the whims of capital expansion, to the next. Latent is when workers are stuck between agriculture and industry. There's a constant flow toward towns. And stagnant, when workers are employed but irregular or doing precarious temp work. Note this would be like precariat or part-time workers. As C and productivity grow, there are more and more stagnant workers with low wages and low skill levels. So, probably many of us are finding ourselves in a situation like this. The point is that the increase in capital accumulation, with every increase in capital accumulation, there's an increase in workers' suffering. They reproduce the means for their own exploitation, the more and the harder they work. And Marx says, an accumulation of misery corresponding with the accumulation of capital. Okay, we're nearing the end here, so thank you for sticking with my talk up to this point. And one of the last things I want to talk about is primitive accumulation. We asked this question at the beginning of the process of MCM at the beginning of Capital. But where does that original M come from? Why do some people have money at the beginning and others don't? So they have to sell the only commodity they have, which is their labor power. Where does that social relationship come from? Okay, and Marx's answer is primitive accumulation. So this started under the pre-capitalist or feudal system, when land was ruled by the aristocratic classes. Peasants produced at this time then for their own needs, and they gave a portion of their produce, the surplus portion, to the ruling class or kings, etc., as probably taxes. But the imposition of private property means that the ruling class used bourgeois law to make themselves not only rulers, but also owners of the peasants' land. And this is really important because let's say in Japan, for example, where I'm teaching about, you might have had the peasant class, for instance, the ruling class, might have been in charge of land and gathering taxes from people over a certain amount of land, but they weren't really the owners of the land. All of the land was on lease from the emperor, right, in theory, okay? But when the ruling class implements liberal bourgeois law, private property law, the foundation of liberal bourgeois law, then they also become the owners of that land. And this creates a whole new relationship. In agricultural society, land is the main means of production. So private property laws resulted in a robbery of the peasants' land, of the means of production, which they depended on for their own livelihoods and reproductions, for producing food, right? Now, in order to survive their livelihoods, and to support their livelihoods, they need to produce based on market imperatives, abstract labor, socially necessary labor time, meaning they need to produce a certain amount to fetch a certain price so that they can pay rent in order to pay to use the land, which was originally theirs and or held in common, okay? So I'll talk more about this with the idea of market imperatives, but once the means of production of agricultural land was put on the market and there was a market for agricultural goods, then that also determined the value of different plots of land. This land should be able to produce this much amount of goods, which has this much price on the market. So and that also determined rent then, right? So in order to pay that rent, they had to produce a certain amount, which was determined by factors completely out of their control. Even if they had a crop failure or a poor harvest one year, it didn't matter, because if there were good harvests in other places, all of the products, right, through abstract labor, are all in this equivalency relationship determined at this price. So this has causes fundamental changes in agriculture. And this is the introduction of the wage relationship, which is the key defining feature of capitalism. So let's look at primitive accumulation and the expropriation of the agricultural population from the land. In the last part of the 14th century England, serfdom was basically gone. It was feudal, but this only means that there was a subdivision of ruled lands, i.e. of a number of people there who paid taxes. Actually, most people owned their land, and the means of production were relatively well off. And they used the commons as well. They had common areas, forests, etc., that everybody used and nobody owned. Then in the late 15th and early 16th century, Flemish wool manufacturers' imports drove up the price of English wool. To compete, feudal lords drove peasants off their lands and the commons to transform them into sheep pastures. Also, there was the loss of power of the English Catholic Church, and the breakup of its lands created more landless proletariat. By the end of the 17th century, the yeomanry, or the independent producers, had been greatly reduced too. So, question: why was the transition from feudalism to modern nation-state beneficial for the ruling class? And the answer is because previously they had just had feudal titles to the land, as I explained. These might have been hereditary. All land was actually the property of the lord or the king. But with the introduction of private property, it became their land, and it was enshrined in law. And Marx says the law itself becomes now the instrument of the theft of the people's land. So, Marx is not too positive in his evaluation of liberalism and bourgeois law here. And he looks at the acts for the enclosures of the commons, And then the capitalist makes large agricultural merchant farms and kicks off small producers. This created a body of the proletariat, landless peasants dependent on wage labor, which grew and moved to the city manufacturing. Marx talks about how highland Celt chiefs benefited too. They used to be only the de facto owners of village land, but they got private property, and that made them actual owners, so that they came into conflict with clansmen. People were then forcefully prevented from immigrating out of the country so that they could be driven to manufacturing cities instead, right? So, land that used to be yours, now it belongs to the Lord. You have no more land anymore, or you can't pay your rent, so either way, you become dispossessed. And, a common solution might just be like, hey, well, I'm just going to pack up and immigrate somewhere and go to a different country. Except you can't, because that's not how modern nation states work. There are no limits for capital, basically, but there are lots of limits for individual people and citizens and rules that we have to abide by. And this is why we have boundaries between nation states, so that people can't move around freely. And Marx talks about the Duchess of Sutherland as an example of primitive accumulation, and we actually read about this example in the class I'm teaching this semester. She turned all her land into sheep pasture and kicked out all 15,000 residents who had been living there. So I identify then 3 patterns of primitive accumulation based on Marx's explanations. This is just my understanding. There might be more, there might be less, it might look different, I have no idea. But this is how I would visualize it, okay? So the first is market imperatives. You start off with farmers and peasants owning their own land. They're independent producers. And they have a total produce that it produces each year, and it varies. But then when they move to a money economy, which with fluctuating prices going up and down for how much a bushel of apples is worth or whatever, this affects then how much money, first off, farmers can get. And also remember that farmers, they don't start off with money. They don't have money. So they have to sell the products of their labor to live. And with that money then, they buy back the means to their existence. Their food and their house and their clothing, they buy back their livelihoods, okay? If this is sufficient, if they can get enough money through total produce of a given year and buy these things, then repeat the process over and over again. But if it's not sufficient, then they lose this land, they're dispossessed, or they have to supplement it with some other kind of wage labor so that they can buy these things. So this would be market imperatives. Now let's look at the second way, which would be the transition from a peasant to a tenant. Again, we have farmers and peasants farming the land, which is theirs. They have a total produce, and the surplus portion of this goes to the lord. So they have to give, in Japan it would have been rice, okay? So you have to give some koku, some barrels, bushels of rice to the lord, but the rest of them you get to keep for yourself, for your village, your family, or whatever. Well, now you transition to money economy. Prices of rice or barrels of apples are going up and down and fluctuating. And this affects the price of land. How many bushels of apples or, bushels of rice a given plot of land should be able to yield, right? So the land value is set in the average expected produce for a similar plot of land. Let's say that the price of a bushel of apples is $15 and that a given plot of land should yield $100. Then maybe farmer has to pay $150 in rent or something like that, right? This is how a landlord would think about it, perhaps. If the yield, the total produce, is at or above this amount, great, then they can pay the rent. But note that the average value of price for all other rent throughout the market would then also go up. So they lose either way here. And then if the actual yield is below this amount and they can't pay the rent, then goodbye, sayonara, they're dispossessed. And the third method is direct expropriation. And this is most like the Duchess of Sutherland example in Marx's Capital 1, that we read about, okay? So you have farmers and peasants on the land, and like I said, this part's the same. They have total produce, surplus goes to the Lord, remainder to themselves. But now, this land becomes the private property of the landlord, okay? Who used to be aristocracy, probably. So he's the lord, he's the landowner. Now it's his property, and he's interested in getting money from this land. And he's got these peasants here. Well, what does he want to do? Does he want to use those peasants? He thinks, do I want to keep growing apples? No, I don't want to do that. I want to raise sheep. That's what he decides. Well, guess what? You don't really need a lot of people to raise sheep. You just need a bunch of land so they can eat grass. Okay? So, boom. He kicks off these peasants, says goodbye to them. They're dispossessed farmers who now become wage laborers, and he replaces them with sheep. Okay? So that would be the third means of primitive accumulation, direct expropriation. And this leads to the genesis of the industrial capitalist. There are two types of capital handed down from feudalism: usurer's capitalism and merchant's capital. Both relied on force. Marx says they all employ the power of the state to hasten the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production to the capitalist mode, and to shorten its transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. Just think about this example, right? How did this guy kick these people off? Force, right? Classical political economists love to think that capitalism is great and free for everyone, okay? And that there's no force involved in there. This is obviously a total myth, but even looking at the history and of primitive accumulation, it's very clear that the entire system is initially based on force. Marx notes slavery as well as a form of primitive accumulation, and he shows how this connects to keeping down workers' wages at home. The veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed, for its pedestal, slavery pure and simple in the New World. He also talks about the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation. The biggest change from primitive accumulation into capital, though, i.e. the capital's origin and distinguishing feature, is, quote, the expropriation of the immediate producers. Note, so that taking back means of production is the goal. But this does not simply mean capitalist means of production, but rather the means of production necessary for the workers. So again, this is different than the common, 20th century view that a lot of socialists, for instance, have held of Marx's idea of class conflict. And note the expropriation of the means of production and private property. But Marx does not advocate just a return to independent producers as private owners of their means of production. He distinguishes between self-earned private property and capitalistic private property. Primitive accumulation is, in other words, in a paradoxical way, a socialization of labor and the common means of production, even though this is based on exploitation. Marx doesn't advocate a return to former feudal pre-capitalist structure. Rather, he says that capitalism creates the conditions for its own undoing. This is through centralization. All that has to be expropriated is therefore eventually only a few capitalists themselves. And now we're talking about the end process of accumulation, right? Because, as I've talked about, the process of accumulation, capital centralizes into the hands of fewer and fewer capitalists, and then in the end, everything is centralized under the central control of just a very small group of billionaires, of the 1%, let's say. But since the means of production, so that all we need to do then is just take that back from a small amount of people, right? Since the means of production have already been socialized, note that centralization will increase people's suffering, but it will also flame the conditions for revolt. And Marx says the expropriators will become the expropriated, and that this is the negation of negation. So Marx's view of historical change here, and some people have argued that Marx changed this view later in his life, or even in later volumes of Capital. Okay, maybe so, or at least the road to get there, right? But he lays out a pretty clear path for it, I think, and it's a bit stereotypical. Probably many of us have already seen and thought about this, but here's how you could visualize it. Under feudalism, there are many scattered individual producers, self-earned private property. Oops, sorry. Whoa. Then with primitive accumulation, the workers were expropriated from the land, the means of production, forming the basis for the capitalist modes of production. And capitalistic private property, the centralization of the means of capital, means of production and capital, but capitalism creates the conditions for its own undoing. Because the means of production and capital also become socialized, you just need to expropriate the social wealth from the capitalists, leading to socialism and communism. Okay, I'm going to stop my talk here. Thank you very much for sticking with me to this point. This was basically all of Capital Volume 1, and I've tried to summarize what I picked up as the key arguments. In this class, we're especially focusing on where that initial M comes from and looking at the history of capitalism and primitive accumulation. But I hope you found this talk to be enlightening and have learned something from it. And I'll be giving the remainder of this talk on Capital Volume 3 and some of Marx's other writings shortly. Thank you.